"Can you read this letter, sir?" "Mom said it's our only hope." The child's words broke the CEO's heart. He was one of the richest men in America, ruthless, untouchable, and feared on Wall Street. But nothing could prepare billionaire Richard Lawson for the moment a shy 7-year-old girl walked into his skyscraper holding a crumpled letter and whispered, "My mom said you're the only one who can save us." The woman he once loved was dying. The daughter he never knew existed was standing right in front of him. And everything he believed about his past and himself was about to be shattered. What was written inside that letter would destroy Lie's 8 years in the making and force Richard to choose between the empire he built and the family he never knew he had. The morning wind swept through the canyon of Manhattan's skyscrapers, carrying with it the hum of ambition and the chill of early winter. Inside the glass monolith of Lawson Capital, polished marble floors echoed with hurried footsteps and clipped conversations. Men in tailored suits and women with sharp eyes flowed like a current toward elevators that promised fortunes. But in the middle of that current stood a small figure, a blonde-haired girl, clutching a wrinkled envelope against her chest. Her boots were scuffed, her cheeks red from the cold, but her gaze held a quiet, stubborn purpose. Abigail Lawson was only 7, but today she carried a mission larger than herself. Her mother's words repeated in her head like a heartbeat, "He's the only one who can save us." With trembling hands, she approached the reception desk, dwarfed by the towering counters and screens flashing stock prices she couldn't understand. The receptionist blinked at her in confusion. Children didn't belong in places like this. "Can you give this to M.R.?" "Richard, please?" Abby asked, her voice soft but firm. "My mom said he's the only one who can help." The receptionist hesitated, glancing around for a parent who wasn't there. The girl looked out of place, a splash of innocence amid the storm of power. Yet something in those eyes, piercing and determined, made her pause. She reached for the phone and dialed the executive floor. "There's someone here asking for M.R. Lawson," she said. "It's urgent." Minutes passed in heavy silence before the reply came. "Send her up." The receptionist knelt down and smiled gently. "Top floor, sweetie. Someone will meet you." The elevator doors opened like the gates of a fortress, swallowing Abby whole. As she ascended, the city fell away beneath her, the horns, the chatter, the heartbeat of New York fading into silence. She tightened her grip on the letter, its edges crumpled by her small fingers. Inside were words written by her mother, words that had taken days to find and years to deliver. Abby didn't fully understand them. All she knew was that they were important, maybe the most important thing she'd ever do. When the doors slid open, she stepped into a world of glass and chrome, where city views stretched for miles and success smelled faintly of expensive cologne and old money. A tall assistant waited to escort her through corridors lined with portraits of founders and plaques celebrating billion-dollar deals. Abby's small shoes squeaked against the polished floor, and every step echoed like a drumbeat. Somewhere beyond those doors, behind a desk worth more than her apartment, was the man her mother said could change everything. Her heart pounded as she entered the reception area outside the CEO's office. A massive American flag hung proudly on the wall, a silent reminder of the values this empire claimed to stand for: freedom, legacy, power. But Abby wasn't here for any of that. She was here because her mother was sick. She was here because time was running out. And she was here because somewhere inside this building was a man she had never met, but whose name she had whispered every night before bed. The assistant gestured for her to sit on a leather couch that swallowed her tiny frame. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as executives walked by, glancing at her with polite confusion. A girl like her didn't belong here, and yet she clung to the belief that this was exactly where she was supposed to be. She traced the edges of the envelope with her thumb, imagining her mother's tired smile and the soft encouragement in her voice. "Be brave, Abby. You're stronger than you think." Finally, a door opened. "R. Lawson will see you now," the assistant said. Abby swallowed hard, sliding off the couch. The hallway ahead looked impossibly long, its floor lined with the weight of decisions that had shaped economies. At the far end, behind a massive oak desk, sat the man her mother once loved, the man Abby had never known. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from the quiet, desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, he would help. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The office was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline like a painting, and the man behind the desk barely glanced up from his papers. He looked nothing like she had imagined. Older, sharper, colder. Yet there was something familiar in the curve of his jaw, the set of his eyes. Abby clutched the letter tighter. "Emma, Richard," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I have something for you." For a long moment, Richard Lawson didn't respond. Then he raised his gaze and met hers, and in that instant, the air in the room seemed to change. The empire he had built, the walls he had erected around his heart, all felt strangely fragile in the face of those piercing blue eyes. He didn't know who this girl was or why she was here, but something deep inside him whispered that his life, the one built on power and precision, was about to change forever. From the 82nd floor of Lawson Capital, the world stretched endlessly beyond glass walls, a city of ambition and chaos beneath the calm order of Richard Lawson's domain. He sat behind a desk carved from oak older than the nation itself, a monument to wealth and control, scrolling through a report that would shift markets before lunch. In this space, time obeyed him. Empires rose and fell on his signature. Every decision was measured, every risk calculated. To his board, to Wall Street, to Washington, Richard Lawson was the kind of man who didn't make mistakes. Once upon a time he had believed in different things. Before the skyscrapers, before the jets, before the headlines that called him the king of capital, Richard was just a boy from Ohio. He'd grown up surrounded by cornfields and church bells, taught to salute the flag, shake a man's hand firmly, and love one woman with all his heart. That woman had been Claire Anderson, until the day she vanished without a trace, taking with her everything soft and hopeful in him. Since then he had rewritten the rules. Feelings were weaknesses, love was a liability, and trust was a fool's currency. The man who once dreamed of a family now built fortresses instead, not of brick and mortar, but of numbers and leverage. His calendar was filled with power breakfasts and defense contracts, his nights with fundraisers and political dinners. His days were so precisely structured that even a single unexpected call could feel like an invasion. And yet, despite the noise of constant success, there was a silence he could never escape, a silence that followed him home to a penthouse where no one waited. Richard's office reflected the man he had become, sharp, efficient, and devoid of softness. The only hint of the past was a small photograph tucked into a corner of his bookshelf. A younger Richard in uniform, arm around Claire, both smiling beneath an American flag. He rarely looked at it anymore. It was a relic of a version of himself that died 8 years ago, the night she disappeared, and a doctor told him he could never have children. That moment had hardened him into steel. The intercom crackled to life. "Ma'am Lawson," his assistant's voice chimed. "There's a child here to see you." Richard frowned, his pen pausing mid-signature. "A child?" He repeated, as if the word itself did not belong in his world. "She says she has a letter from someone named Claire," the voice continued. The pen slipped from his fingers. Claire, a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in years. A ghost suddenly breathing again in the middle of his morning. He leaned back in his chair, staring out at the skyline as if the answer might be hidden somewhere beyond the steel and glass. Logic told him to ignore it. This was a distraction, probably a scam, or worse, a trap set by one of his rivals. But curiosity, that stubborn remnant of the man he used to be, whispered otherwise. "Send her up," he said finally, his voice steady, but colder than the wind whipping past the tower's edge. Minutes later, the door opened, and the receptionist from downstairs appeared, followed by a small blonde girl with eyes that seemed to see straight through him. Richard's first instinct was to dismiss her, but something in those eyes stopped him. They were bright and determined, yet vulnerable, like they carried a story far bigger than her small frame. "Mr. Lawson?" she asked softly. I have this for you." She stepped forward and extended the crumpled envelope with both hands. He took it without a word, the paper trembling slightly between his fingers. It was addressed in handwriting he recognized instantly, delicate, deliberate, and achingly familiar. Claire. His pulse quickened despite himself. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he studied the girl. Her posture, her voice, even the way she avoided his gaze felt strangely significant. And then he saw it, the color of her eyes, blue, exactly the same shade as his own. For the first time in years, Richard felt his carefully constructed world shift beneath his feet. Questions collided inside him faster than he could catch them. Why was Claire reaching out now? Who was this child? And why did her presence make his heart ache in a way he thought it never could again? He didn't have the answers yet. But deep down, one truth gnawed at the edge of his hardened soul. This was not a random interruption. This was the past, knocking on the walls of the fortress he had built, and it had finally found a way inside. He sat back in his chair, the envelope heavy in his hands. Beyond the glass, the city roared with the usual noise of ambition, but in this office, time felt like it had stopped. Somewhere inside the sealed paper was a message that could unravel everything: his power, his certainty, his solitude. And for the first time in a long, long time, Richard Lawson wasn't sure if he was ready to open it. Richard turned the envelope over in his hands, as if it were a relic from another lifetime. His thumb brushed across the seal, and memories he had buried under board meetings and billion-dollar deals surged to the surface. Claire's laughter echoing across an Ohio summer, the way she used to smooth his tie before investor dinners, the night they promised each other forever. That was before betrayal, before infertility, before his heart calcified into something unrecognizable. And yet here was a letter written in her unmistakable hand, demanding to be read. The doctors had said he could never have children. This was a manipulation. It had to be another lie. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. Richard read the letter again, slower this time, searching for cracks, inconsistencies, anything that could disprove what he was seeing. But the words were steady, pleading, and painfully sincere. He slid a letter opener beneath the flap and unfolded the paper slowly, almost reverently. Claire's words spilled out in delicate script, each one a knife twisting deeper. If you're reading this, it means I don't have much time left. I need you to know the truth. Abigail is your daughter. I left to protect her, not to hurt you. Please, she needs her father now more than ever. Richard's breath caught. It was impossible. It had to be. She spoke of nights spent rocking a newborn to sleep alone, of birthdays uncelebrated, of a child who had grown up hearing stories of a father she had never met. Claire wasn't asking for money or forgiveness, just for him to be there. It was a request that terrified him more than any hostile takeover ever could. Across the desk, Abby shifted nervously, watching his expression change with every line he read. "My mom says you're a good man," she whispered, as if trying to convince herself as much as him. Richard set the letter down, his hands trembling. "How old are you?" he asked quietly. 7, she said, smiling shyly. "I was born in the spring. Mom says I have your eyes." It was such an innocent statement, simple, factual, but it felt like a hammer against the walls he had built. Anger rose in him like a tide, cold and familiar. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "I can't have children." "That's a fact." He pressed the intercom. "Get security," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. Abby's face fell, confusion clouding her wide blue eyes. "But she said you'd help," she whispered. Richard turned away, refusing to meet her gaze. "I don't know what kind of game this is, but it ends now." The door opened and 2 men in suits entered. Abby clutched the letter, backing away. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "She's really sick. She said you were the only one who could save us." But Richard didn't answer. He stared out the window, watching taxis crawl like ants below, anything to avoid the sight of the girl being gently escorted from his office. The sound of the door closing behind her echoed louder than any applause he had ever received. Alone again, Richard sank into his chair and stared at the letter on his desk. It felt like a ghost had slipped into his life uninvited, a ghost carrying a truth he wasn't ready to face. The idea gnawed at him, growing more insistent with every second. What if it was true? What if the impossible wasn't a lie, but a mistake? He shook the thought away. Logic, reason, science, they all said this was nonsense. But beneath that cold logic, something warmer and far more dangerous whispered, "What if she's telling the truth?" The rest of the day passed in a blur. Meetings came and went, phone calls were answered and forgotten, and yet Richard's mind never left that letter. He saw those blue eyes every time he closed his own. He heard her small voice. She said, "You're the only one who can save us." He had faced down senators, billionaires, and investigations, but none of them had shaken him like the words of a dying woman and the plea of a little girl. By the time the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows across his office, Richard was no closer to certainty. But one thing was undeniable. The fortress he had built around his heart had been breached. And for the first time in 8 long years, he felt something he had sworn he would never feel again: doubt. And beneath that doubt, something even more dangerous was beginning to stir, the faint, stubborn spark of hope. Richard didn't sleep that night. He poured himself a glass of bourbon, stared out over the city, and replayed Claire's letter in his mind until the words carved themselves into his thoughts. By dawn, the anger that had fueled his denial had cooled into something quieter but more persistent: the need for answers. He couldn't ignore the possibility, however faint, that there was truth in Claire's words. And if there was even a chance Abby was his daughter, he needed to know. Hours later he found himself in Queens, a neighborhood he hadn't set foot in since before the Empire. Gone were the polished floors and towering glass walls of his office. Here the sidewalks were cracked, the air smelled faintly of exhaust and street food, and the buildings leaned against each other like weary old men. It was a world far removed from Wall Street, and yet, somewhere behind one of these worn brick walls, his past was waiting for him. He stood outside the address written at the bottom of Claire's letter, heart pounding in a way it hadn't since he was a young man. He could have turned back. No one knew he was here. He could have returned to his penthouse and pretended none of this ever happened. But something stronger than pride pushed him forward. He climbed the stairs, knocked on the faded blue door, and held his breath. When it opened, the sight before him nearly brought him to his knees. Claire stood there, thinner, paler, and more fragile than he remembered, but still unmistakably her. A scarf covered her head, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the edge of the door. For a long moment neither spoke. Then her lips curved into a bittersweet smile. "Hello, Richard," she whispered. "Why now?" he asked, his voice colder than he intended. "Why come back after all these years?" Claire sighed and stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. The apartment was small but warm, filled with signs of a life built quietly. School drawings taped to the fridge, books stacked on a worn coffee table, a pair of tiny shoes by the door. "I never wanted to leave," she said softly, "but after what happened, I thought it was the only way to protect her." "Protect her from me?" he snapped. "You lied to me, Claire. You disappeared without a word. And now you expect me to believe that child is mine?" She turned to face him, eyes glistening but unwavering. "I left because you didn't believe me," she said. "I told you I was pregnant. You accused me of cheating. And when the doctors said you were infertile, you decided the truth was impossible. You pushed me away before I ever had the chance to explain." Her words hit harder than any accusation he'd ever faced in a boardroom. Memories he had rewritten in anger now twisted into something painfully different. "I was trying to protect myself," he muttered. "I'd already lost everything once." Claire stepped closer, her voice trembling but resolute. "And in doing so, you lost everything again. You missed her first steps, her first words, all because you couldn't believe I was telling the truth." Richard turned away, unable to look at her. The walls of the apartment felt like they were closing in, filled with evidence of a life that had gone on without him, a life that should have been his. "I don't know if I can believe you," he said finally. Claire nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Then don't," she whispered, "but believe her. She's not asking for your forgiveness. She's just asking for a father." He left the apartment with more questions than answers, his heart heavier than when he'd arrived. The truth was no clearer now than it had been before, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Not for Claire, not for Abby, and not for him. As the city lights flickered to life around him, Richard Lawson realized that for the first time in 8 years, the past wasn't behind him. It was right in front of him, and it was demanding to be faced. The next morning, Richard stood in his office with the same relentless determination that had built his empire. Only this time the mission wasn't a merger or a hostile takeover. It was the pursuit of truth. The letter still sat on his desk, its creases now deep from being read over and over. No amount of denial or anger could erase the image of Abby's blue eyes staring back at him. If there was even a chance she was his daughter, he needed proof, undeniable, scientific proof. He called Claire and arranged a meeting at a private medical clinic, the kind used by New York's wealthy to keep their secrets. Claire agreed immediately, her voice calm but tired. When they arrived, Abby clung to her mother's hand, glancing nervously at Richard. The silence between them was heavy, a mixture of fear, hope, and resentment. Richard kept his distance, refusing to let emotion cloud his judgment. This was about facts, cold, hard, irrefutable facts. As the nurse swabbed Abby's cheek, she looked up at Richard with a wide-eyed curiosity only a child could have. "Does this mean you might be my dad?" she asked. The question pierced straight through the armor he'd spent years building. He swallowed hard, searching for words that didn't come. "We're just trying to understand the truth," he replied, his tone softer than he expected. Abby smiled faintly, as if that was enough for now. Claire went next, then Richard. Each sample was sealed and labeled, and with that, the waiting began. Days crawled by, each one heavier than the last. Richard buried himself in work, but even billion-dollar deals couldn't drown out the question echoing in his mind. What if she's mine? He pictured Abby's face in board meetings, heard her voice in the hum of the trading floor, and dreamed of a family he'd long since given up on. When the call finally came, he was in the middle of negotiating a massive acquisition. The clinic director's voice was clinical, detached. "The results are in," she said. "You are not the biological father." The words slammed into him like a freight train. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We double-checked the samples," she replied. "The results are conclusive." Richard ended the call and stared blankly out the window. Rage surged through him, at Claire, at himself, at the universe for reopening a wound only to pour salt into it. He called Claire immediately and demanded a meeting. They met at a small park near her apartment. "It's over," he said coldly. "I knew this was a lie. I knew you were manipulating me again." Claire tried to speak, but he cut her off. "You should be ashamed," he spat before turning to leave. Abby stood nearby, her eyes wide with confusion. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked. Richard froze, unable to turn around. "No," Claire whispered, pulling her daughter close. "None of this is your fault." But Abby didn't believe it. As Richard walked away, she broke into quiet sobs, her small shoulders shaking with heartbreak. He didn't look back. He couldn't. If he did, he might crumble completely. Back in his penthouse, Richard poured himself another drink and told himself he was right, that this was a scam and he was lucky to escape it before it ruined his life. But the justification rang hollow. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Abby's tears. Every time he tried to focus on work, Her voice echoed in his head. "Does this mean you might be my dad?" And no matter how many times he repeated the words, "not the father," they didn't bring him peace. For the first time in his life, Richard Lawson, the man who believed numbers never lied, found himself questioning the truth that science had given him. And deep down, a gnawing doubt refused to die. What if the truth was being hidden? What if the test itself was a lie? Days passed, but the bitterness that usually fueled Richard's ambition failed to take hold. Instead, something unfamiliar haunted him: guilt. He tried to bury it beneath meetings, media appearances, and market forecasts, but the image of Abby's tear-streaked face clung to him like a ghost. Even when the board congratulated him on a record quarter, the applause felt hollow. Somewhere out there, a little girl believed he hated her, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, that thought broke him. He found himself pacing his penthouse late into the night, bourbon glass untouched on the table. Claire's words replayed over and over. "She's not asking for forgiveness. She's just asking for a father." He thought about his own father, a man who never missed a baseball game, who taught him to stand for the anthem and to keep his promises. That man would be ashamed of what he'd become. Richard Lawson had built an empire, but somewhere along the way he had lost his soul. One morning, unable to stand the silence any longer, Richard made a discreet phone call. "Find out everything you can about Claire Anderson's medical situation," he told his assistant. "Spare no expense." The report arrived 2 days later, and the details hit him harder than any market crash. Claire's cancer was terminal. The treatments she needed were beyond what she could afford. Without help, she might not live to see Christmas. That night, without telling anyone, Richard wired a large sum of money to the hospital under an alias. It was enough to cover the treatments, the medication, and even a private care nurse. He told himself it was just to ease his conscience, nothing more. But deep down he knew the truth. It was an act of love he didn't want to admit he was capable of. A week later, a small envelope arrived at his office with no return address. Inside was a child's drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. Above them, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "Thank you." At the bottom, in letters drawn carefully and proudly, were 2 words that hit him like a punch to the chest: "Your daughter." The drawing sat on his desk for days, untouched but never ignored. Every time he looked at it, a crack formed in the armor around his heart. He found himself wondering how Abby was doing, whether Claire's treatments were working, whether the little girl still believed he was a monster. The questions burned in his chest, refusing to fade. For a man who had spent his life controlling every variable, this new feeling was terrifying. He couldn't buy his way out of it, negotiate it away, or bury it under spreadsheets. It was deeper than guilt. It was responsibility. And with every passing day, that responsibility felt less like a burden and more like a calling. One evening, Richard walked to the window and looked down at the glowing city below. For years, he had believed that power was about wealth and influence, about bending the world to his will. But now, for the first time, he wondered if true power was something far simpler, the courage to do what was right, even when it hurt. He didn't know what the next step would be. He didn't know if Claire would ever forgive him, or if Abby would ever look at him without sadness in her eyes. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was done running from the past, and whatever it took, he would make things right, even if it cost him everything. The days that followed were unlike anything Richard had experienced before. The man who once thrived on chaos and competition now found himself distracted by thoughts that had nothing to do with balance sheets or board meetings. Every news alert about market shifts, every report from his legal team, seemed trivial compared to the unanswered question that gnawed at his chest. What if Abby truly was his daughter? Evelyn Brooks noticed the change immediately. Sharp-eyed and calculating, she had built her own power within Richard's empire, and she could read him better than anyone. "You're somewhere else lately," she said one evening over dinner in their penthouse, her tone carefully measured. "This isn't like you." Richard didn't look up from his glass of wine. "Just a busy quarter," he lied. But Evelyn wasn't convinced. "Busy quarters don't make you stare out windows at night," she said, setting her fork down. "What's really going on?" He deflected with vague excuses, but Evelyn pressed harder. "This is about her, isn't it? The woman from your past. And the child." Her voice dripped with disdain on the last word. "Don't let them trap you, Richard. They're lying to get something from you." Her words hit a nerve, but not in the way she intended. For the first time, they didn't sound convincing. Instead, they sounded desperate, like someone afraid of losing control. At Lawson Capital, the board of directors was growing restless too. A high-profile acquisition loomed on the horizon, and Richard's lack of focus was starting to show. "We need you at full capacity," one of them warned during a tense meeting. "This company is you. If you're distracted, we all suffer." Richard nodded, but his thoughts were far from the boardroom. Every time he looked out over the Manhattan skyline, he wasn't thinking about shareholders. He was thinking about a little girl's drawing taped to his refrigerator at home. The pressure built from all sides. Evelyn accused him of being manipulated. His board questioned his leadership. His investors whispered about instability. And through it all, the image of Abby's eyes, those same piercing blue eyes, haunted him. No matter how many times he told himself to focus, his heart was somewhere else. And for a man who had built his identity on control, that loss of focus felt like a crack running through the foundation of everything he had built. One night, after yet another argument with Evelyn, Richard found himself driving through the city without a destination. He passed the glittering towers of Wall Street, the quiet neighborhoods of Queens, and eventually stopped outside a modest apartment building, Claire's. He didn't go inside. He just sat there in the car, watching the lights in their windows flicker on and off. Somewhere inside, Abby was probably doing homework or brushing her teeth. Somewhere inside, there was a life that could have been his. Back in his penthouse, the silence felt heavier than ever. Evelyn was asleep, her presence suddenly suffocating, instead of comforting. Richard stared at the ceiling and asked himself the question he'd been avoiding for weeks. What do I really want? The answer came quietly, but undeniably. Not another acquisition. Not another headline, not another $1 billion in his portfolio. He wanted to know his daughter. He wanted to be more than a man with power. He wanted to be a man with purpose. The realization didn't solve anything, but it changed everything. For the first time, Richard saw his empire for what it was, a cage. It had protected him from pain, but it had also kept him from happiness. And as the first light of dawn crept across the skyline, he knew the walls of that cage were beginning to crumble. A week later, Richard's resolve was tested in a way he hadn't expected. He was in the middle of a strategy session when his assistant slipped into the room, looking uneasy. "Sir," she whispered, "you might want to come to the lobby." Richard frowned. "Can it wait?" "I don't think so," she said. "It's the girl." The elevator ride down felt longer than any deal he'd ever closed. When the doors opened, there she was, Abby, standing in the same marble-floored lobby where their story had begun. This time there was no letter in her hand, no plea written in ink. Instead, she clutched a folded piece of paper covered in colorful crayon. "Hi," she said shyly when she saw him. "I wanted to show you something." He knelt down to her level as she carefully unfolded the drawing. It was simple but powerful, 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright blue sky. Above them, in wobbly handwriting, were the words, "Me, Mom, and Dad." Richard's throat tightened. "I thought families were supposed to help each other," Abby said softly, "even when things are hard." For a long moment, Richard couldn't speak. No boardroom victory, no Wall Street headline had ever made him feel this kind of weight. "Abby," he began, but she interrupted with a giggle. "I made you taller than Mom," she said, pointing to the picture. He laughed, a real, unguarded laugh he hadn't heard from himself in years. "I like that," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. They spent the afternoon together, something he hadn't planned but didn't want to end. They walked to a nearby cafe, where Abby ordered hot chocolate with extra whipped cream and peppered him with questions about everything: his favorite color, whether he liked dogs, what kind of cereal he ate as a kid. It was the happiest he'd felt in years, a joy so simple it felt almost foreign. As they parted ways, Abby hugged him tightly, her small arms wrapping around his waist. "I'll see you soon, okay?" "Nice," she said, looking up with absolute trust. Richard hesitated, but then nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "You will." And for the first time he meant it. That night he found himself staring at the drawing again. It now sat framed on his desk, a reminder that, for all his wealth and power, the most valuable thing in his life might be a 7-year-old girl with too much faith in him. He wasn't sure if he deserved it, but he knew he wanted to try. The next morning he walked into the office with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The market could wait. Deals could wait. For once, Richard Lawson's priorities had shifted, and they pointed not toward the top of the financial world, but toward a little girl who believed he could be a father. And if she believed it, maybe, just maybe, he could believe it too. The days that followed felt different. Richard still attended meetings, still signed deals, still moved markets, but for the first time his heart wasn't chained to the numbers. He checked in on Claire's treatments, sent small gifts for Abby, and even rearranged his schedule to be available when she wanted to visit. Yet beneath this growing bond a nagging unease took root, a voice whispering that something about this story still didn't add up. And Richard Lawson was not a man who ignored instincts. One evening, long after his staff had gone home, Richard sat alone in his office and opened a new file on his laptop. He typed a single name, Claire Anderson, then another, Evelyn Brooks, and finally, DNA Lab, Manhattan. The questions he'd tried to bury began to surface again. Why had the test results been negative when Abby looked so much like him? Why had Claire vanished so suddenly all those years ago? And why did Evelyn seem so desperate to keep him away from the past? The next day, he hired a private investigator, one of the best in the city, and gave him a single instruction: find out everything. Within a week, the man returned with a folder that would shatter everything Richard thought he knew. Inside were documents, phone records, and photographs that painted a picture more disturbing than he could have imagined. Evelyn had met with Claire weeks before her disappearance. They had exchanged multiple calls and money. Even more damning, the investigator uncovered a connection between the technician who handled the DNA test and one of Richard's oldest rivals, Michael Reeves, a man with every reason to destroy him. The pieces clicked into place with chilling clarity. The negative test, the manipulation, the years of silence. It wasn't fate or coincidence. It was a carefully orchestrated lie. Richard felt the ground shift beneath him as anger, deep, blistering anger, surged through his chest. Evelyn hadn't just lied. She had stolen 7 years of his life, 7 years of birthdays and bedtimes, first words and first steps. She had turned his love into distrust, his hope into hatred. And Michael? He had weaponized that betrayal to weaken him from the inside out. That night, Richard stared at his reflection in the darkened window of his penthouse. The man looking back wasn't the ruthless billionaire who could buy and sell companies before breakfast. He was a father, and someone had robbed him of that. No more, he whispered into the silence. They're not getting away with this. He poured himself a drink, but didn't touch it. Instead, he picked up his phone and called the investigator again. I want every detail, he said. Every document, every message, every thread. We're going to uncover everything. The plan forming in his mind wasn't about revenge. It was about truth, and about reclaiming the years stolen from him and his daughter. As the city lights blinked far below, Richard realized that the war for control of his life had never been fought in boardrooms or courtrooms. It had always been fought in the shadows, and now he was finally ready to fight back. The second DNA test was conducted in absolute secrecy. Richard personally oversaw the chain of custody, choosing a laboratory in Boston with no ties to anyone in his orbit. This time there would be no tampering, no hidden hands manipulating the results. It was science against lies, and Richard was determined to see which one would win. The waiting was agonizing. Every day felt like a year, every hour an eternity. Abby visited once during that time, proudly showing him a school project about family trees. I put you here, she said, pointing to a spot beside her mother's name. Even if you're not my dad, you're still my family. The words nearly broke him. He smiled and hugged her, but inside his heart was a storm. If the results were negative again, he didn't know if he could bear it. The call came 5 days later. Richard answered on the first ring. Ma Lawson, the scientist began. The results are in. Abigail Lawson is your biological daughter. Probability, 99.97%. The world seemed to tilt beneath his feet. He sank into his chair, unable to speak. For years he had built walls to keep himself from pain, but they crumbled in an instant under the weight of 7 stolen years. The memories flooded back all at once. The night he had accused Claire of betrayal, the anger that had driven them apart, the lonely years he had buried himself in work. All of it, every ounce of suffering, had been built on a lie. And now the truth was staring him in the face. Abby was his daughter. She always had been. and he had missed it all. The fury returned with a vengeance. Richard stormed into his penthouse, waiting for Evelyn to return from a charity gala. When she walked in, dressed in diamonds and confidence, she froze at the sight of the papers in his hand. "We need to talk," he said, his voice trembling with restrained rage. Evelyn tried to play innocent, but the evidence was undeniable. The payments to the lab, the calls to Michael, the forged documents. And then, finally, she broke. "Yes," she hissed, the mask slipping. "I did it. I paid them. I made sure you'd never believe her. You were building something, Richard, an empire, and I wasn't about to let some small-town nurse and her child ruin that." The words struck like a knife. "You stole my family," he whispered. "You stole my daughter's life," Evelyn shrugged coldly. "I did what I had to do." Richard didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Pack your things," he said quietly. "By tomorrow morning I want you out of this house and out of my life." Evelyn tried to argue, but he was already walking away. For the first time in years, he felt something stronger than anger, clarity. Later that night, Richard called Claire. His voice was steady but raw. "I know the truth now," he said, "and I'm so sorry." Claire was silent for a long moment before she spoke. "I never wanted revenge, Richard. I just wanted you to know her." He swallowed hard. "I want to know her too, and I want to be there for both of you, if you'll let me." The conversation ended with no promises, but with something better, a second chance. And as Richard stood by his window, the skyline glittering like a field of stars, he knew that the story of his life was being rewritten, not in the language of wealth or power, but in the simple, enduring truth of family. The morning after Evelyn's departure, Richard woke to a silence that felt different, not empty, but liberating. The fortress he had built around his life was crumbling, but for once he didn't care. He poured himself a black coffee and stared out at the city skyline, knowing that the next chapter of his life would no longer be written in boardrooms and financial reports. It would be written in playgrounds, hospitals, and the quiet moments that make a family. The fallout came quickly. News of the scandal spread through Wall Street like wildfire, whispers of falsified paternity tests, insider manipulation, and personal betrayal. Shareholders panicked. Investors called emergency meetings. Reporters swarmed the lobby of Lawson Capital, shouting questions about the billionaire's secret daughter. For most of his career, Richard would have done anything to protect his empire. But now it all seemed so meaningless. During a tense board meeting, his top advisors begged him to make a statement, to distance himself from the chaos and restore confidence. Richard listened quietly, then stood. "I'm stepping down," he said. A stunned silence followed, effective immediately. "I'll retain a minority stake, but Lawson Capital will go on without me." Gasps filled the room. "This company was built to create wealth," he continued. "But wealth isn't what matters to me anymore. My daughter does." The press erupted within hours. Headlines blared. "Wall Street Titan walks away for family. Billionaire chooses daughter over empire." Analysts speculated about his next move, but Richard didn't care about any of it. For the first time, he walked out of the building without a security detail, without a meeting on his calendar, and without a single regret. He was no longer the man chasing profit. He was the man chasing redemption. Claire was hesitant when he showed up at her apartment that evening. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "There's too much happening." Richard shook his head. "I'm exactly where I should be." Abby came running from the hallway, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Daddy!" The word stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't just a name. It was forgiveness. It was a second chance. He spent the evening helping Abby with her homework, laughing over burnt grilled cheese sandwiches, and listening to Claire hum softly in the kitchen. It was a simple life, one far removed from the penthouses and power brokers he had known, but it felt more real than anything he'd ever experienced. When Abby fell asleep on the couch beside him, her small hand wrapped around his finger, he knew he had chosen correctly. Of course, not everyone was happy with his decision. Evelyn's lawyers threatened lawsuits. Investors demanded answers. Former allies turned their backs on him. But Richard met every threat with calm resolve. "Do what you must," he told them all. "I'm done fighting battles that don't matter." He wasn't trying to win anymore. He was trying to heal. Days turned into weeks, and slowly the noise faded. Richard found peace in small routines, picking Abby up from school, attending Claire's doctor appointments, cooking dinner on Fridays. He had traded boardrooms for bedtime stories, and it was the best trade he had ever made. And yet, beneath the joy, one truth remained. Time was running out. Claire's condition was worsening. The doctors were hopeful but cautious. And Richard, for all his newfound purpose, knew he might soon face the hardest chapter of all, one he couldn't fix with money, power, or will. Claire's health began to deteriorate faster than anyone had expected. The treatments were brutal. Long hours in sterile hospital rooms, the constant beeping of monitors, the thinness of her hair, the exhaustion etched into her once radiant face. Richard was there through all of it. He read to her from her favorite books, held her hand when the pain was too much, and stayed awake at night to watch her breathe, terrified that if he blinked, she might slip away. Abby tried to stay strong, but even she could see the fear in her father's eyes. Every night, she knelt beside her bed and prayed, not for toys or trips or anything a child might usually ask for, but for her mother to stay. "Please, God," she whispered, "don't take her yet. We just became a family." The innocence of her words shattered Richard's heart. He promised her that he would do everything in his power to protect them, but deep down he knew there were battles even he couldn't control. Still, he refused to give up. He hired the best doctors in the country, arranged experimental treatments, and spared no expense in giving Claire a fighting chance. But the disease was relentless. Each passing week seemed to take a little more from her. Her strength, her energy, her voice. And with each step backward, Richard's resolve only hardened. This wasn't just about saving Claire. It was about saving the future they had only just begun to build. One evening, after a particularly harsh round of chemotherapy, Claire drifted into sleep while Richard sat at her bedside. He reached for her hand and held it tightly, his mind swirling with memories. Their first date at a college football game, the night they danced barefoot in the kitchen, the moment he first imagined growing old with her. "I wasted so much time," he whispered. "But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." The next morning, as dawn painted the hospital room in soft gold, Richard found Abby sitting beside her mother, sketching pictures of their family. "She looks happy here," Abby said, pointing to the smiling stick figure of Claire. "She is happy," Richard replied, his voice steady, "because she has us." And for a moment, even with the weight of uncertainty pressing down on them, It felt true. But the battle was far from over. Claire's doctors warned that the next few weeks would be critical. Her body was weak, and the risk of complications was rising. Every phone call from the hospital made Richard's chest tighten. Every beep of a monitor sent his heart racing. Yet he stayed, through the exhaustion, through the fear, through the endless nights. He had spent a lifetime running from pain. Now he faced it head-on. Abby continued her nightly prayers, and Richard began to pray too, something he hadn't done since he was a boy in Ohio. Kneeling in the quiet of the hospital chapel, he whispered words he hadn't spoken in decades. "Give me the strength to protect them, and if I can't, give me the strength to endure." It wasn't a deal or a demand. It was a surrender, and somehow that surrender gave him peace. The race against time was one he might not win, but it was a race he refused to abandon. Claire was his family. Abby was his purpose. And even if the world crumbled around him, Richard Lawson would fight until the very last second. Not as a billionaire, not as a titan of finance, but as a father and a man who had finally learned what love truly meant. The call came just after midnight. Richard had been dozing in the hospital chair beside Claire's bed when the alarm on her monitor erupted into a frantic chorus of beeps. Nurses flooded the room, their movements swift and practiced, but the urgency in their voices made his blood run cold. Her blood pressure's dropping. One of them shouted. Another adjusted the four-line, while a doctor barked orders that blurred together in Richard's panicked mind. He tried to reach for her hand, but they were already wheeling her toward the ICU. He followed them down the sterile corridor, his chest tight and his legs heavy. Abby woke to the commotion and ran into the hallway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Daddy, what's happening?" she cried. Richard knelt and gripped her shoulders. "They're taking care of Mom," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "She's strong. She's going to fight." But inside his faith was crumbling. This wasn't a boardroom crisis he could outthink. This was life and death, and it was beyond his control. Hours passed with no news. Richard paced the waiting room, his heart pounding with every second that ticked by. Images of Claire, laughing, smiling, holding Abby as a baby, flashed through his mind like a cruel slideshow of everything he stood to lose. He had spent years building a life defined by certainty and control. Now none of it mattered. All the money in the world couldn't buy what he needed most: more time. Eventually the weight of it all became too much. Richard slipped into the hospital chapel, a small, dimly lit room tucked away on the third floor. He sank to his knees before the empty altar, hands clasped tightly together. It had been decades since he'd prayed, not since his father's funeral back in Ohio. But now, words poured out of him in a desperate whisper. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Don't take her from us. I've wasted so much time already. Just give me a chance to make it right." He thought about the lessons his father had taught him, about duty, sacrifice, and faith. For so long he had dismissed them as naive ideals, relics of a simpler world. But now they felt like the only truths worth holding on to. "I'll do anything," he continued, tears blurring his vision. "I'll give up everything. Just let her stay." It wasn't the voice of a billionaire or a power broker. It was the voice of a man stripped bare, a man who finally understood that love was the only thing worth fighting for. Hours later, a doctor emerged from the ICU. "She's stable for now," he said, his tone cautious. But it was close, very close. Relief hit Richard like a wave, leaving him weak and shaking. He thanked the doctor and hurried to Claire's bedside. She was pale and unconscious, but her chest rose and fell with each precious breath. He took her hand in his and held it against his heart. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm not leaving." Abby crept into the room a few minutes later, clutching the small stuffed bear she always carried. She climbed into the chair beside her mother and laid her head on Claire's arm. "I prayed too," she said softly. "I think God heard us." Richard smiled through his tears. "I think he did too." The night stretched on, and Richard refused to close his eyes. Every breath Claire took felt like a miracle, every beat of her heart a gift. And as dawn crept across the sky outside the hospital window, he realized something profound. He had spent his life chasing power because he thought it made him strong. But true strength was this, sitting by the woman he loved and the daughter he'd almost lost, holding on to hope even when the odds were against them. It was in that quiet, fragile moment, as the first light spilled across Claire's sleeping face, that Richard made a promise. No matter what the future held, no matter how long or short their time together might be, he would never again take a single second of it for granted. Claire's recovery was slow but steady. Weeks passed before she was strong enough to sit up in bed without help, and every small milestone, a smile, a laugh, a walk down the hallway, felt like a victory. Richard was there for all of it. He read to her from her favorite novels, cooked her homemade meals, and held her close when the nights were long and painful. In those quiet moments their old wounds began to heal. The bitterness faded. Trust, once shattered, started to rebuild itself piece by fragile piece. But Richard knew their story couldn't truly move forward until the truth was brought into the light. Evelyn and Michael's actions had stolen years from them and nearly destroyed their lives. They couldn't be allowed to hurt anyone else. So while Claire recovered, Richard prepared for war. He gathered evidence, contacted federal investigators, and built an airtight case that traced every payment, every forged document, and every manipulation back to them. The hearings made national news. Evelyn and Michael were subpoenaed, their lies exposed under oath. Emails, financial records, and lab reports painted a damning picture of their conspiracy. How they had sabotaged a paternity test, falsified legal documents, and even interfered with Claire's medical care to keep the truth buried. Their motives were clear: greed, power, and control. But in the end, none of it could withstand the weight of the evidence. The courtroom was packed on the final day of testimony. Richard sat beside Claire, their hands intertwined, as the judge delivered the verdict. Guilty on multiple counts of fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy. Evelyn was sentenced to years in federal prison. Michael faced heavy fines and a lifetime ban from the securities industry. Justice had been served, and with it came a sense of closure Richard hadn't realized he needed. But perhaps the most important part of the trial wasn't the punishment. It was the redemption. Richard's public testimony, in which he admitted his own failures and spoke openly about the value of family over fortune, resonated across the country. News outlets that once painted him as a ruthless billionaire now called him a symbol of transformation. He gave up everything for love, one headline read, and in doing so he found everything that truly mattered. The case's conclusion marked a turning point. The scandal no longer defined them, it freed them. Claire was still fighting her illness, but she was surrounded by love and support. Abby thrived, her laughter filling rooms that had once been silent. And Richard, once consumed by power, found peace in the simplest moments: Sunday breakfasts, bedtime stories, quiet walks in the park. One evening, as the three of them sat on a bench overlooking the Hudson, Claire leaned against him and whispered, "You did it. You brought us justice." Richard shook his head gently. "We did it," he said. "And we're just getting started." For the first time in his life, Richard Lawson felt truly free, not because he had won, but because he had chosen what was right. And as the sun set over the city that had once been his empire, he realized he had built something far more lasting than wealth or power. He had built a family. Spring arrived in New York with a kind of quiet grace, washing the city in soft sunlight and cool breezes. It had been months since the trial ended, months since the storm that once consumed their lives finally passed. The skyscrapers still stood tall, the market still roared, but for Richard Lawson the world had changed completely. He was no longer the man who measured success in numbers and quarterly reports. He measured it now in laughter echoing down a hallway, and small footsteps running toward him after work, in the warmth of a family he once thought he'd lost forever. Claire's health, though still fragile, had stabilized thanks to new treatments. The doctors called it a miracle. Richard called it grace. They sold the penthouse, too big, too empty, and moved into a modest but beautiful home in the suburbs, complete with a white picket fence and a backyard where Abby could chase fireflies on summer nights. It wasn't the empire he had once dreamed of, but it was better. It was real. It was home. Life settled into a rhythm that felt almost magical in its simplicity. Mornings began with breakfast together, Abby insisting on making pancakes shaped like stars, Claire teasing Richard for burning the coffee. Afternoons were for school pickups and impromptu picnics in the park. Evenings ended with movie nights, Abby nestled between them on the couch, her laughter louder than any applause Richard had ever received. These were the moments he had missed. These were the moments he had fought for. Richard also turned his fortune toward a new purpose. He founded the Lawson Family Foundation, dedicated to supporting single mothers, children of veterans, and families torn apart by injustice. The work gave him a deeper sense of fulfillment than any business venture ever had, and in every scholarship awarded, every home built, every medical bill covered, he saw reflections of his own journey, a reminder that redemption was not just possible, but powerful. On Abby's 8th birthday, their home filled with balloons and the scent of chocolate cake, friends and neighbors gathered, and laughter spilled out into the street. When the candles were lit, Abby closed her eyes tight before blowing them out. "What did you wish for?" Richard asked, smiling. She grinned up at him and whispered, "I didn't have to wish. I already have everything I want." The words nearly brought him to tears. He lifted her into his arms, holding her close as Claire snapped a photo, a picture that would become one of his most treasured possessions. It wasn't a portrait of wealth or power, but of love, resilience, and second chances. It was proof that even the most broken stories could find their way to a happy ending. Later that night, as the house grew quiet and Abby drifted off to sleep, Richard and Claire sat together on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one. Do you ever think about how different life could have been? Claire asked softly. Richard nodded. All the time. But then I look at her, at us, and I realize this is exactly how it was meant to be. Claire rested her head on his shoulder, and for a long moment they simply breathed together, content in the peace they had fought so hard to earn. The future was still uncertain. Claire's health, the challenges ahead, but they would face it together. And that, Richard knew, made them unstoppable. As the night air wrapped gently around them, Richard whispered a silent promise to the stars above, to protect this family with everything he had, to cherish every day they were given, and to never again let pride or fear steal another moment from them. Because patriotism, he now understood, wasn't just about flags or power or wealth. It was about loyalty, sacrifice, and love, the kind that builds homes, heals hearts, and proves that even after the darkest nights, a new beginning is always possible.